Hi everyone, welcome to TSAM Digital. My name's Amy and today I'm joined by Rachel Whittaker, who is Head of Sustainable Investment Research at Robeco, and we'll be discussing sustainable and impact investing. So hi Rachel, it's great to have you.
Hi Amy, great to join you.
Okay, so let's just kick off. So I think just to get us started, could you just tell us a little bit about your background? Because I know that you've worked in asset management and wealth management when it comes to sustainable investing. So it would be nice just for our viewers just to hear a bit about that.
Sure. I've been working in the investment industry for more than 20 years now, and 15 of those have been working in the sustainable investment space. And I've seen that, as you say, from the perspective of institutional asset management, but also from wealth management. And also from the investment consultancy perspective. So I feel like I have quite a broad view of how the whole field of sustainable investing has evolved over the last 15 years. And we've certainly seen a lot of change. And the last 5 years or so in particular have been very exciting.
Amazing. So you obviously work in the research team, and across those different industries, as you say, have you noticed a difference in the types of insights that the teams have got based on the types of needs that their clients have? Because institutional and private are very different.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a difference in the insights, but certainly a difference in where we place our focus. So on the wealth management side, we're catering much more to the very personal and very individual values of individual investors. Sometimes they might also be experts in investment, but more often than not, they're not investment professionals. So what really matters to them is where money is going, money that maybe family money or money that they've earned through being entrepreneurs or business leaders and so on. So there's an awful lot of what do they care about, much more so than in the institutional space, where we're really still focusing our attention on the crossover between issues that are important to sustainable development, but that are also going to contribute to financial returns. So at the moment, and we're starting to see those two aspects coming together a little bit, with the institutional space paying much more attention to the impact of their investments and to the impact that the entities and the companies they invest in have on the world. But I think it's still a little bit more at the moment where wealth management is more focused on real world change and very personal values, and the institutional space is still much more focused on ESG integration and financial materiality.
That makes a lot of sense, given the personal values versus company goals. And in both cases, I know that risk return is still an important factor, as you say. So thinking about the current financial climate in the markets, do you see any trends with, what investors are looking for, or any kind of issues with the geopolitical climate? Because I know we've had the Ukrainian invasion, we've got inflation, there are so many things happening right now, energy crisis. So how is that impacting institutional side or even the wealth side, if you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for us at Robeco, the attention that the current environment, particularly with the war in Ukraine, that's brought much more attention to climate risk and energy security. It's really brought that to the forefront. Climate change and investing to mitigate climate change has been rising in importance over, in recent years anyway. It's been a gradual increase, but I think the last few years we've really seen that become one of the preeminent topics within sustainable investing. But this year in particular, it became really focused on energy security. We're now looking at real, happening risks of reduced access to energy. It's much more emphasis within individual countries on how they are going to gain some energy independence. And so, that's also alongside that meant that it's created much more of a focus on how that transition away from fossil fuels can happen, and how it can not only benefit sustainable development, but it can also create much more energy security within companies. So although there are still some kind of short-term bumps in the road that we expect towards, in that road towards a transition away from fossil fuels, I think that we're still seeing a really strong momentum. And if anything, what we're currently seeing in the geopolitical environment should help drive that energy transition. There's always questions about where the funding is going to come from and how exactly it's going to happen. And individual countries have their own political environments that they have to navigate. But I think it's what we're seeing now has really emphasized the need for that energy to transition to happen sooner rather than later. And so that's one of the key things that we look at within my team, within the SI research team. We look at how well individual companies are positioned within their sector and towards the commitments that the companies themselves and the industries they operate in have made to move towards net zero. We look at whether companies have the right policies, strategies, the right funding in place to meet their commitments, and whether they're on that path to make it within the time frame that either they've committed to or that we think they need to meet those goals. And that kind of research feeds into both more traditional, globally diversified portfolios, as well as more thematic portfolios that are specifically focused on looking for companies that are managing climate risk well. But I think one of the other interesting topics that we've seen in the last few months, perhaps not so much related to risk and return, although it is a question of looking for returns, is I've been asked more times in the last 6 months about whether weapons should be in sustainable portfolios than I have in the entire previous 14 and a half years that I've been in this field. It was always a given up until recently that you wouldn't find weapons companies in a sustainable portfolio. And the questions and the discussions that are happening around the war in Ukraine about whether we need weapons to maintain peace, to protect democracy, these are some really interesting discussions that we've been having both internally and also that I've been asked by external stakeholders. And often there's, as with many issues in sustainability, there are many grey areas. There's no easy answer. Perhaps this is one of those issues where personal values come into play more so than financial issues. But I think, ultimately, as far as our approach goes, we still exclude weapons from portfolios. We feel that in an ideal world, you wouldn't need weapons, and using weapons to promote peace leads to all sorts of other problematic questions, like who decides what is the right use and when is the right use. And we take a very cautious, kind of precautionary approach to thinking about what goes into our portfolios. And we don't believe that weapons belong in there, even if in the short term they might be necessary to deal with current global issues, but they're certainly not something that we would want to see in a sustainable portfolio. So it's been a really interesting year so far, both in terms of what's been happening in terms of the influences on our investment returns, but also in terms of the philosophical discussions around what we include in sustainable portfolios.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting, actually, because I thought we kind of moved away from that, as you say, basic kind of do no harm strategy into kind of active impact, kind of creating a bit more real world change, as you say. So it's interesting that these kind of crises can put those questions back on the table, look at whether they're right in the short term and bring into it the whole ethics around it, as you say, whether that's at a company level or based on personal values or at the asset manager's own discretion, I guess. So really good to know that, actually. I wonder if, I'm sure other people are having these conversations too. So on that note then, because you mentioned a lot of these new risks that have come up this year, I understand that you've developed a sustainable development goals framework. So has this kind of changed your strategy in that? Has it shaped what you're doing because all these new questions have arisen?
We haven't changed our strategy towards our SDG framework as a result of what's been happening in the world this year. And that's largely because our SDG framework is very much focused on which companies are making a solid contribution to the sustainable development goals. It's focused on the pure impact that these companies have on sustainability. And from that perspective, it's quite distinct from the ESG integration approach that we also have, where we're looking at what is the financial impact of ESG issues going to be on this particular company, at this point in time in this sector. And in many respects, the two approaches are complementary, because sustainable investors, they want to be investing in sustainable companies, but they also want to make returns. So the SDG framework is looking for companies that derive a significant, usually at least a third of their revenues from products and services that make a specific contribution to one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. It focuses on the products and services because that's where we think that companies' core impacts come from. As a secondary step, we do also look at how they operate. And obviously, if there are any particularly egregious practices, then those negative impacts do offset the positive impacts that come from products. But in that sense, it is quite distinct from more traditional ESG ratings that focus more on how companies operate and a little bit less on what they produce. And we're really focusing on mainly what is the company's output. Where we have the challenges within that framework is trying to make it more forward-looking and not just backward-looking on what companies made in the last year, but looking at those transition industries as well and trying to capture the positive impacts that come from companies who are trying to pivot their business models away from products and services that maybe in the past had a neutral or maybe even a negative impact, but to invest in industries that are becoming more sustainable. A good example is things like electric vehicles and companies that are trying to pivot away from more traditional engines towards electric vehicles. And most of the companies that operate in that space tend to derive a fairly small part of their revenue currently from those industries. But I would say that's where we really try and capture some of the emerging positive impacts. And these are really long-term trends. So what we're looking for isn't affected by, month on month or, quarter on quarter changes in the current environment. But we're looking for, ideally, which will be the companies that are going to be driving the change towards a more sustainable future, and in the long run, ideally be the companies that are still operating and are successful in that future when we get to it.
It's a really good point, actually, because we always talk about how data is missing in ESG, but I think a lot of it is looking in the past, as you say, and we don't look ahead at the future, or which companies are kind of leaning into different innovations and creating a new way to invest sustainably. So I think closing thoughts then, if you had to advise someone who's looking to invest long term, what kind of advice would you give them? This could be about types of equity they get involved in, or, as you say, how to make sure that they're looking ahead at data instead of looking backwards.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting and very open question. I think ultimately, if we're looking longer term, I want to say 5 years plus, that's long term in the investment industry. But when we're talking about sustainability, longer term is 30, 40, 50 years out. Certainly when we do our analysis on climate risk and pathways towards net zero, we're looking out 30 years or more. But in terms of investors trying to position themselves for future returns, we've seen a lot of growth in thematic investing over the last decade or two, and I think in the sustainability space, there's still a lot to be said for trying to position yourself towards these industries that we expect to see higher growth. A greater trend towards sustainability is going to push more funding towards green industries. But I think not only on the environmental side, some of that is very well documented, and there are a lot of investment opportunities available that are looking at environmental solutions and companies that are well positioned to grow in this space, but also thinking about on the social side, where what are the kind of companies that are making a difference to our society. And the environmental and social issues can be quite closely linked sometimes, but sometimes the social bit gets a little bit forgotten about with all the emphasis that we have on the environment, and there's much more data available on environmental themes, and on the social side it's much harder to gather that kind of data and have a very structured approach towards looking for companies or industries that have social impacts. So I think trying to get exposure to those long-term growth industries, but also thinking about which are the companies that are really going to make a difference to people. I would see that as, personally, I see that as a sweet spot where I would like to be positioned.
Yeah, that's very true. I think even at our conferences, we often talk about the E in ESG, but, it's quite a European thing to focus on climate change and the environmental side and forget a bit about the social and governance side. So that's something that we're looking to try and open more discussion on here on this channel and at our conferences as well. So I'm looking forward to having you taking part in our panel discussion on ESG and climate risk, actually to discuss this further. But I think that's all we've got time for today. So it'll be great to have you in November. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for watching.